Welcome to Philosophy Podcast. I'm your host, August Baker, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Professor Katie Ebner-Landy. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
And this book is The Character Sketch as Philosophy, Manners, Mores, Types. So let me just read some from the book jacket and an endorsement or two. The book jacket says, in the 4th century BCE, the philosopher Theophrastus, a student of Aristotle, composed 30 character sketches depicting ordinary Athenian vices. We've got idle chatter, someone who has bad timing, a coward, someone who's shameless, someone who's superstitious. Centuries later, this enigmatic text, which became referred to as the characters, was feverishly translated and imitated by early modern Europeans convinced of its moral and political importance. Tracing this resurgence of the Theophrastan tradition, Katie Ebner-Landy sheds new light on the role of the character sketch as a philosophical tool. And at the end of the book jacket, it says, a revealing intellectual history. The character sketch's philosophy also encourages us to consider what literary description might contribute to ethics and political thought today, and to think critically about the kinds of character sketches on which we still rely, from the snob to the mansplainer. And then 2 endorsements from Teresa Bejan. With wit and erudition, Katie Ebner-Landy charts an unexpected course through the history of philosophy. The character sketch appears in her account as a lost philosophical art, ripe for revival, dedicated to deriving moral benefits from bad examples, from ancient oligarchs to modern mansplainers. This is an arresting and delightful debut. Oh, I should mention this is Harvard University Press, 2025. And David Armitage. The character sketch's philosophy elegantly illuminates a lost tradition of ethical reflection. With exemplary erudition and grace, Katie Ebner-Landy recovers Theophrastan character writing from the condescension of philosophy to argue persuasively for its contemporary relevance as a genre of virtue politics. I learned so much from this book, and I had never even heard of the character sketch before reading this book. Let me give you a really high-level summary of the book. Tell you how bad it is. I would say that this character sketch was something that Theophrastus did more than 2,000 years ago. And then it was kind of lost, and then it was refound, and it came to fashion, it waxed and waned, and it actually didn't really have a decline downward. It actually reached kind of a high water mark with La Broyeur in, is that the way to say it?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, and in about 300 years ago. But then Hume came along, shot it down, and it has not been considered one of the tools of philosophy since then. On the other hand, there are calls for philosophy to consider more of this technique, and you might associate the name Rorty with that. There's my very high-level summary.
That was great. I'd say only add a few things to the high-level summary,
Okay.
which would be the kind of strange and striking thing about the character sketch is that on its own, it was thought of holding a kind of philosophical potential. One of the early Renaissance translators described it as a kind of third method of doing philosophy. So today, if you wrote a philosophy paper only of character sketches, that would be very strange. However, lots of philosophers all the time use character types within their arguments. So when you mentioned Rorty famously uses the type of the liberal ironist.
Right.
But you kind of pick a philosophy, you can think, when they're making an argument and say, my objector, the neutral person, would say this. And you can think about the different ways in which character types enter into argument but aren't thought of on their own as holding this kind of status as being a third kind of philosophy.
Okay, great. I take that I understand that. What were the other two kinds?
So it depends on the author
Hmm.
in question. So the person I mentioned who first kind of brings out this third kind of philosophy argument is Isaac Casaubon, amazing philologist, 16th century. And he compares it to dogmatic philosophy. So kind of arguments from first principles and paranesis. So a kind of self-help advice style argument.
Okay.
So the character sketch is somewhere in between the two,
Hmm.
um, a third method, but also a third method between philosophy on the one hand and poetry on the other, which is what's so
Right.
interesting. He
Right.
describes it like an intermediate genre between poetry and philosophy.
Right. Okay. I was going to ask about that because one of the endorsements spoke about literature. I just, it's kind of you could think of it as a very pared down literature. Like it doesn't have any narrative really. It's just a capturing something.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what really struck me about him. It's a snapshot.
Hmm.
So, yeah, the favorite character I have is the man with bad timing, who comes up a lot in the book. But that sketch just starts with the man with bad timing is the kind of person who, when you go up to, he goes up to someone who is busy and asks his advice. He sings love songs to his girlfriend when she has a fever, and he goes to a wedding, but then criticizes marriage. And so it's someone who always does the wrong thing, perhaps even a good thing. Maybe like
Right.
singing love songs to his girlfriend is a good thing, but at the wrong time. And that kind of gives us all these different situations in which this character would find himself. But it's not really like a story of a life. It's a kind of more like a mechanism. Put him in this situation, he'll behave like this. Put him in this situation, another situation, he'll behave like that. So
Right.
it's this kind of snapshot approach to telling the story of a person.
Right. So my favorite, and it's probably because they remind me of me. I have two of them. I'm going to tell you. One is, I'll just, this is by a 2022 translation by Pamela Ment. She says, this is a paraphrase of Theophrastus, over 2,000 years ago, but it's very recognizable, I think. The busybody. The busybody is the sort who tries to separate the parties in a fight, even if he doesn't know them. When he's leading others along a shortcut, he can't find the way to his destination. And then this is great. He goes up to the general and asks him when he's going to deploy his troops and what orders he'll give the day after tomorrow. And then the other one I want to share is the surly man. I'm this often. The surly man is the sort who, when asked, where is someone or other, says, don't bother me. When addressed, he doesn't respond. He won't wait long for anybody. He'll refuse to sing or make a speech or dance. He won't even offer thanks to the gods. I love those two. So we take those two. What are the characteristics of a character sketch?
Okay. So, first of all, they are ordinary vices. And I use that after philosopher, political theorist Judith Shklar, who entitled a book, Ordinary Vices, after Theophrastus. And so what do I mean by they're ordinary? Well, it's interesting that you felt totally comfortable saying, oh, I'm this kind of person. It wasn't like a deeply shameful thing.
True.
It
Hmm.
was an ordinary thing that we all have these kinds of vices. And I can totally be the man with bad timing myself.
Right,
Um,
right. I figured. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Uh, and they're not like lust and envy. They're not the kind of the later seven deadly sins. So they're kind of like nothing spectacular, nothing unusual, the kinds of vices that we see around us every day. Second thing is that they are comic. We both had a laugh. We liked
True.
the translation. Mm. And yeah, to us, kind of read like observational comedy, which
Yeah.
provokes the mystery, which is to us, they seem kind of comic, a little bit like clearly have a grain of truth going on, but we wouldn't immediately say, yes, philosophy or politics. And for
Right.
me, that was the puzzle. I read them and I thought, I don't know what this is. Like, I recognize myself and perhaps some people I know in all of these characters. They seem at once literary. They clearly smack a little bit of ethics, something to do with politics, but I couldn't quite figure it out.
Hmm.
And so that's what got me hooked onto trying to answer the question of what they were, and then more broadly, what this form is, which seems at once kind of ancient, but also is absolutely translated and adapted into contemporary equivalents.
Very much so. Yes, I reading it, I came up on my own with the modern example, and you mentioned it, and it was in the endorphins of the mansplainer. It's something that we I recognized it as this form immediately, right?
Right.
So then maybe that suggests that there's certainly something about it that's very useful. And as you say, philosophers use it. And I think, yeah, the liberal ironist, or I think about Charles Taylor, clearly he's talking about this when he's arguing against something, he wants to say what this person is like, what this philosopher is like that's doing this, and what is really driving them underneath it,
Right.
as a way of, yeah, it's just such a powerful way of doing philosophy. But in that case, it's about another philosopher. These are about ordinary people, right?
Yeah.
And mansplainer, I don't know if that's so. That's also about ordinary people, not about. I mean, I guess it could be used about another philosopher. So when you look at it, one of the things it is kind of like a comedy, and one of the things is it kind of like comedy. Just suddenly you realize it. It's a sudden thing. Yes, I recognize that,
Yeah.
as opposed to argument and deliberation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is basically, there's a lot to say about the mansplainer, but I think the suddenness of the revelation gets us onto a really important theme of the book, and a thing that is true about the character sketch over time, which is vividness and the arrival at a kind of truth in presentation via vividness of showing a passion as it is manifested in a person. So what's really interesting about the original set of 30 characters, or these types that Theophrastus depicted, is that the titles that are given to each character are the quality in general. So it will be like absent-mindedness or bad timing. And then the character sketch is an answer to the problem of, how do we describe absent-mindedness? Well, let me give you a really vivid depiction of someone who is absent-minded. And
Right.
so you get a kind of micro argument in that form, which is, in order to actually show you this quality, I have to describe someone who has it and how it manifests in their life. And I think that becomes centrally what is interesting to a lot of people over generations about this form, which is that it's this vivid expression of a passion as embodied by a person.
And it uses uh, concrete details.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that was one other thing I should have said about what is kind of definitional about those examples you read. Concrete details, so concrete that now Theophrastus is like very tricky text to translate, because it's full of like this specific vegetable at the market that is
I see.
used by this person. But also, as we noticed in the examples you read, very little interiority. So very little explanation for why any of these characters behave as they do. We don't know why the surly man is surly. I mean, maybe you'll tell us, but we
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
know.
I got you. No, I see that. One of the things I can't remember which chapter it came from, but I really was interested in was you said that a lot of them have the feel of conversational non-cooperation.
Yeah. So this is a quote by Paul Millett, who is a brilliant reader of the characters, and he describes a lot of the types as being, conversational non-cooperators,
Yeah.
which you can see basically how their specific vices prevent deliberation, dialogue, smooth running of kind of civic life.
Yes.
And because we're in Athens, that's not just a benign problem
Right.
between individuals. That's a political problem.
Right.
And actually lots of the characters end up showing off how their vices manifest in more political institutions. So let's take the man with bad timing again. He shows up to a trial to give evidence after it's already been decided. Now,
Right.
if your citizens behave like that,
Yeah.
you're in trouble. And especially if they can't be in dialogue, deliberate, decide on political things together, you lose the very foundation of a kind of, this democracy that, with all of its flaws, at least prioritized forms of discussion.
Right. The surly man he don't,
Yeah,
just says, don't bother me. And he just doesn't respond.
exactly.
And the
Yeah.
busybody says the exact wrong thing to the general. I don't even know how the general is going to respond to that.
Yeah. I think the busybody completely doesn't recognize their role, like where their limitations of their role lies. Yeah. And on the non-cooperation point, it helps us clarify this very strange character, which starts off the whole collection, which is the ironical man, the iron. So what is irony? Big, difficult question. How do we understand it? But in this case, it's someone who always kind of says the opposite of what they mean. And that's really also very difficult if you're trying to cooperate with someone in a conversation,
Yeah.
because sometimes this character is translated as the dissembler, like the liar, and can't really do dealings with a liar if you're trying to figure out how to work collectively together.
Even though I've read these, each time you refer to them again, something like an example pops in my mind. Oh, that's just like so and so from 30 years ago that I remember.
Oh, great. Yeah.
It's very concrete. All right, let me jump around as is my custom. Chapter 1, but chapter by chapter. Chapter 1 says it is titled Characters as Virtue Politics. And I've certainly heard the term virtue ethics as the third type of moral philosophy. So, but I don't think I'm able to say what virtue ethics is off the top of my head. So I will give you an exam question. What is virtue ethics and what is virtue politics once we know what virtue ethics is?
Okay.
So I can't say it. I'll just ask you to.
Yeah, no, you did. I think you did a great job.
Okay, well, thanks.
Virtue ethics takes its foundation from Aristotle, even though it was popularized in the 90s by Anscombe. And the kind of central question that you want to be asking in deciding on moral questions in your life, if you're a virtue ethicist, is what kind of person do I want to be? So when you're faced with a kind of ethical question or dilemma, you think, what kind of person do I want to be in this situation? So let me give an example from my life to make this more concrete. I am a very flustered traveler, in the sense that I usually travel alone and I want to travel to places fast, and I'm very ready to kind of cut queues and essentially see it as a space where ethical norms don't apply if I'm just rushing to get my flight. And my partner said to me, what kind of person do you want to be in the airport? Why is it separate to the kind of person you want to be in your life? And that would be a perfect virtue ethical approach to the question of who we are, how do we make moral decisions? And so now I'm a bit more respectful of the queue. So
wow, that's really good.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, okay.
And that really changed my mind, in a way that maybe other kind of moral views wouldn't have. I'm
a terrible driver, always cutting people off, and I never really understand arguments against it. But that's a good argument.
Yeah,
what kind of person do you want to be in the car? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Oh, I'm glad. And so a couple of other things to highlight about virtue ethics that might be helpful is, that there are a set of kind of traits that you want to develop in order to live well. Perhaps most importantly is practical wisdom, the ability to decide on the right quality to deploy at the right time. Is this an instance where I need to be courageous? Is this an instance where I need to act in a specific way? How do I moderate what kind of trait I'm going to use? When someone's trying to mug me, am I going to be courageous and say, hey, what's going on here? Let's have a conversation. Am I going to be reckless? Am I going to be cowardly, etc.? And as we know, of course, for Aristotle, the answer is the mean, finding the mean between those two bad options, either being excessive or being deficient. Yeah, and I think probably just for our purposes, one other thing that might be important to highlight is the role of habit and of forming your character over time by doing a set of different things, by doing a repeated practice. So in the case of my airport thing, this will only be bedded in if I, next time I take a flight, I do that, I see how I feel. And maybe fellow passengers are not why is this British woman cutting the queue all the time? Maybe they treat me nicely, and I learn something from that process, and I carry on kind of developing that habit. Yeah, so that would be the virtue ethics.
Ethics, okay.
And then virtue politics. So this term has been massively popularized by James Hankins, who wrote about virtue politics in the Italian Renaissance. And his idea was what was most important to the humanists was soulcraft as a means to statecraft. So you've got to craft your citizens' souls to make them better people as a way of making better cities. And what I am hoping to contribute to that debate is in ancient Athens, you had, in the form of the character sketch, a kind of virtue politics. How do you make the right kind of citizens for a state to run? You've got to be sensitive to lots of things. You've got to be sensitive to, are they going to be surly? You've got to be sensitive to how are they dealing with timing? You've got to be sensitive to the micro ways in which we interact with each other in order for our city to better run.
So I have a visceral reaction immediately to this. I mean, because I wonder whether there's implicitly there's an assumption, or listeners might think that is relevant to today. And I want to jump up and say, for some reason, um, it was so different then, for Theophrastus. It was such a small group of people, in my understanding, who were making the decisions. And that it was like big, I don't know, maybe a big family or a commune or something where your decisions and you're making decisions together. And so you really need to be getting along. Whereas now, what is the political? It's more, you have this vote, which isn't about how you're acting when you go there or what your ethics are. It's just this one little check mark if you even vote. I don't know why I want to jump up and say that, but what do you think about that? Do you, it was, it may have been it may have had a political importance then, but not today.
Okay, yeah, so many different thoughts. So I think like the virtue, to use that word again, of this tradition is to show how many of our behaviors are political in this very like thick relational way.
Okay.
Because it's about what kind of society we imagine ourselves to be living in with other people. And
Okay.
so to go back to my flustered traveler example, when I'm doing that, I'm being like, I don't know, I'm being extremely selfish individual. As a
Right.
flustered traveler, I'm saying my rights are more important than other people's rights. My need to get this flight, which I've left no time to get to, is more important than other people's patient,
Yeah.
well-timed airport queuing. And that's a version of a kind of approach to understanding the self in society, and the kind of world that we want to build. And when I try and revise my behavior, I'm hopefully trying to revise the kind of self I want to be and the kind of world I want to live in, where we respect each other in a slightly different way. Now, I want to be very clear about something, which is that, of course, to change a society, to live in a better world, changing these kind of micro behaviors is nowhere near going to be sufficient at doing that. And I think what the character sketch tradition invites us to pay attention to is A, how many different types we use to structure ourselves. So what I mean by that is, I don't want to be like the mansplainer. I don't want to be like that bad teacher I had a long time ago, who's the paradigm of the bad teacher. I don't want to be this kind of parent. Like, we're constantly using types to structure our own behavior.
Right.
Now, that might not be capital P political. It might not be changing institutions from the ground up.
Yeah.
But it might be changing some kinds of practices that are really foundational for how we live kind of ethical lives together. So like the parenting example would be a good one. What are the bad role models for parenting? How do I change myself to not be like them? And that's
Right.
changing that institution kind of in this very small way.
Right. I think, yeah, you hit it on the head. I think when I heard political, I don't know whether this is an American thing or my thing, but I immediately think, oh, we're talking about politics, like president and who
Right.
gets elected.
Yeah.
And for I have to remind myself that when philosophers use the word political, it often means more than what I would say social, or getting along with others.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Oh, you know, chapter 2 is about. I'm sorry, did I interrupt you there?
Not at all. No.
Chapter 2 is about moral instruction by bad example. And I think that we can see from our conversation so far, these tend to be negatives. And the mansplainer is not something you want to be. The busybody is something you don't want to be. The surly, the bad timing. And so I was going to ask you about, is that part of the part of the form or the genre? Is it focusing on negative things as opposed and trying to avoid things as opposed to positive positive character sketches, something we want to emulate or something we want to adopt?
Yeah. So what's striking about the 30 types in their initial form, and then when they're translated by all these kind of humanists in the 16th century, is they are exclusively of vices. And some of the translators are like, oh my God, maybe the virtues have been lost. What are we going to do? I wish
There
we
is
had the
another, yeah.
virtues, right? And they're
Which would
concerned.
happen with whenever you're looking at ancient texts. Maybe there was the other half that was lost. Yes, absolutely. Okay.
And like I've made, try to make sense of what it means to only use these vices and how these vices can themselves be instructive, which is a kind of negative exemplarity of who you don't want to be. And we speak a lot about positive exemplarity in our lives, in the contemporary world, but also in the Renaissance, there's a big discourse of positive exemplars. And often that takes the form of historical lives. So one kind of parallel tradition to this is Plutarch, who writes, the lives of exemplary individuals
Mm,
historically. These, on the other hand, are the lives of ordinary, typical, vicious characters. And
right.
so they're doing something slightly different.
Completely. And it occurs to me, you take a character. Another way of doing this is to take a character. You can do a character sketch. You can also do a character from literature or from, like, I think of just an example. I don't know if you know this show, Modern Family. It's a comedy, but there's a character called Phil Dunphy, who's this realtor, and he's very positive and so forth. And sometimes when I'm going to speak to someone on the phone that I don't want to speak to, someone in customer service, I'll just kind of adopt the Phil Dunphy character as opposed to the surly person, my normal guy.
Right.
And I'm really consciously, I've got this model in mind and I'm doing it. You can take certain characters from fiction and they become models you can emulate.
Completely. Yeah, completely. I think as the tradition goes on, you get not only vices, you get virtues start to be added to the characters, where you could have the like Phil Munphys of the past
Right.
being used to be exemplary and
Yeah,
exactly the
yeah,
And you also get characters who, on the surface, don't really seem virtuous or vicious at all. So you get, like in the 17th century, this massive explosion of properly like sociological characters. So you get the button maker from Amsterdam, my tailor, the host, the drunken Dutchman. You get like a whole kind of host of more social characters who perhaps resemble a bit more like the chipper estate agent that you're describing,
right,
who nonetheless, as in your case, clearly have this virtuous appeal. I'm going to
right.
adopt these kind of qualities that they possess in this kind of situation.
Yeah. All right, let's go on to chapter 3 actually, let's skip on to chapter 4 in the interest of time. Oh, you know what? I haven't even said who you are. Let me just, Katie Ebner-Landy is assistant professor of aesthetics in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Utrecht University. She's been a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows, and her articles have appeared in The Guardian, Le Monde, and The New Yorker.
While we're recapping,
Yeah,
let's go back to the
go
past.
ahead.
Can I say one thing that I forgot to say,
Yeah.
which I think might be clarifying, which is in relation to our political discussion. So the one explicitly political character in the collection is not the Democrat,
Right.
is not the king, is not the tyrant, but it is the oligarch.
Yeah.
And that's very interesting. And so the presence of this one explicitly kind of party political character in a set of vices also encouraged me to think about what is going on here? There's something obviously seems political that Theophrastus decided to include one character of someone who's oligarchic, which clearly to him seems like a vice.
So oligarchy is one of those words that I wasn't. So to me, that means what? Governing by the few. Could you remind me of what the sketch is? What the
Yeah. So you're completely right, ruled by the few. And that sketch is of someone who goes into the kind of public assemblies and says, I think one person should be speaking here, or one person should be organizing this festival. But he's also someone who is overly lavish. So he has his fingernails expertly trimmed. He wears kind of this, I think he wears his fancy purple cloak. Like he's someone who's kind of spending money on the wrong things, lavish, luxurious, and who also is really advocating for the rule of one in public spaces. But he's a bit of a failure, which is also interesting because
Okay.
whenever he speaks about his political views, he does it at like midday in the hot sun in the middle of the agora where everyone is actually doing something else or having a siesta.
Right. Okay. So, and you could imagine that Theophrastus himself, you discussed this, that this Theophrastus himself may have had a axe to grind against oligarchs.
Yeah. So the first thing I wrote about this was an article about how it seems like we can take seriously this claim made later by Plutarch that Theophrastus twice liberated his native city in Lesbos from tyrants. And so I was like, wow, that seems super interesting. And so I did a bit of investigation as to what that would mean, whether that would be true, how could that happen. And it's possible, I think, that he could have lobbied Alexander the Great to help liberate his city from tyrants. And in that case, you've got a kind of vision of Theophrastus as someone who's more politically engaged than we have previously thought.
And is that consistent with the idea of him opposing oligarchs?
Yeah, because it would be, well, I suppose you could have had a change of heart. You could see tyranny as different to oligarchy. You could see the rule of tyrants as being, yeah, different to the rule of just the few.
Okay.
But I think if we're kind of thinking in terms of would he be leaning towards a democracy in Athens or would he be leaning towards an oligarchy?
I
Different
see.
grounds for thinking leaning towards a democracy. But it's
Okay.
quite a vexed question. Yeah.
I understand. And don't have a lot of records and so forth. Okay. So chapter, actually, I've only done chapter one. So chapter two, moral instruction by bad example. Let's talk about the example that you give in there of the Spartans, sort of striking example of how they encouraged their youth not to drink.
Yeah. So this story emerges in the kind of prefatory materials, the prefaces, introductions to a Latin translation of the characters. And in describing the hoped effect of the characters on its audience, its readership, one of the translators says, look, consider the Spartans. What they used to do was give their slaves loads of wine so that they could be drunk. And then they would take the rich boys, their sons, to see these slaves drunk and disorderly, and thus learn who not to be, how not to behave, why being drunk would be a bad thing.
Yeah.
And so you see,
Very effective.
huh?
Very effective for their goal, no doubt.
Yeah, like seeing people being drunk and disorderly. But of
And
course,
associating that with being a slave.
yeah, exactly. And like perhaps being a slave to your kind of passions as well. I hadn't really thought about that before.
So this can, oh, are you still there? Did I?
Yeah,
Okay.
no, I'm still it.
All right. It raises the question of, well, it seems that character sketch can be used by either side or any side for its own purposes. It doesn't seem, no? Oh, yeah,
Completely.
yeah. It doesn't seem, it's not a method, like if you take maybe utilitarianism or Kantian, it's supposed to lead to the correct answer, right? Whereas what kind of person you want to be could be anything. It could be either any side.
Yeah, there's a lot there. So definitely think that the character sketch can be used by whatever political persuasion you are. You can name like the aggressive feminist just as much you can name the mansplainer.
Right.
So it's definitely not a surefire literary practice to get you
Right.
to which would necessarily guide you to one specific goal. No,
Right.
no. So I think the hope here is not to say, look, if we want to change the world, let's go and make character sketches. It's rather to say, let's notice this persistent feature of our language, the way in which it shapes how we make decisions on the kinds of people we want to be, and how it ends up not only happening in speech, like the mansplainer, but also in popular fiction, TV, cinema,
Sure.
literature, and to help us pay attention to the characters that are not only these big titular characters with huge interiority as
Mm,
having ethical value, but all these
mm.
other little characters that we may not really know what's going on in Phil Numphrey's head, but he may still actually be someone who is affecting lots of members of the population in how they are guiding their ethical behaviors in certain instances.
So let's talk then about Hume. So, which is chapter five, no, no, chapter six. The what are the arguments that Hume gave? I mean, I guess, maybe a quick high level summary of why Hume said, as I said, he sort of shot down character sketch. This isn't something that philosophers should be doing.
Yeah. So, very strikingly, at the beginning of the first inquiry, Hume says, look, there are these two ways of doing moral philosophy. One of them he ends up associating with painting. It's this very literary practice, full of observations, very concrete. And the other he associates later with anatomy, which is about kind of finding the principles that underlie behavior.
Hmm.
And he says, look, for too long, we have been doing painting on the one hand, and contemporary versions of anatomy often are really bad. They often become obscure and they stray into parts of metaphysics that they have no right to be straying into. And so we got to do something with these two methods. And so his proposal is that he wants to make a better kind of philosophy, which is like an anatomy, finding the principles which underlie social behavior and the mind in general. This is the inquiry concerning the understanding. He wants to do that, but he wants to write it in a way which borrows from all the kind of literary, interesting tradition that the earlier painterly mode of doing philosophy was kind of accomplished in. And lots of Hume scholars have been very interested, rightfully, in the question of how exactly does this mix work? So
Mm,
there's a letter in which Hume says, happy if we can fuse these two modes together and to make I can't remember exactly the quote, but to make the moralist and the metaphysician agree better, to make moralism and metaphysics come together. But there has been a bit less attention on the question of what did he mean by the painterly mode of philosophy? What was
mm,
that?
mm.
And what's really interesting is that the kind of authors that he chooses to exemplify the painterly tradition are La Bruyere, who we spoke about right at the beginning, Jean de
Right.
La Bruyere, French moralist, best-selling author of an edition of Theophrastus, Joseph Addison, newspaperman, essayist, who wrote lots of characters in The Spectator, and Cicero, who was very interested in the rhetorical practice of notatio, which was kind of rhetorically sketching characters, otherwise known in Greek as ethopoeia, which is literally from the idea of poeia, poiein, to make,
Hmm. Hmm.
ethos, character. So you've got Hume saying, all right, let's move away from this tradition of thinking of the character sketch as a third kind of philosophy. Instead, it's one of these two obvious kinds of philosophy, painting or anatomy, which now needs to be superseded by my new combination. So the third kind of philosophy ends up being flipped on its head with Hume's new equivalent.
Ah, so he didn't see character sketch as painting. He saw it as something else.
No, he did see it as part of that kind of painting tradition.
Okay.
I think that when he's talking about that first kind of painterly tradition
Mhm.
of doing philosophy, he's talking about character sketches.
But he wants to, in his new method, it's going to use painting, but not be exclusively painting. Is that the idea? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So he wants to find the principles underlying things. He might use character sketches on the way, but that's
Sure.
not going to be the only way of doing philosophical work. Like La Bruyere. La Bruyere thinks he's doing philosophy, but what he's doing in his Characters or Manners of the Age is principally writing characters with a few kind of scattered remarks here and there and a bit of a kind of theological excursus at the end. But what he's writing is the Characters or Manners of the Age, but considers himself as a moral philosopher.
Right. So, I'd never heard of Le Bruyere until I read this book, or I may have heard of it, but it seems like the canon has excluded, went along with Hume.
Yeah,
Can you say a little bit about La Bruyere?
yeah, of course. So let's imagine 17th century France. So you have this wave of moralist, is what they've come to be known as in the literature, of people trying to really incisively describe human character. So the most famous of those is probably not La Bruyere, because he is a little bit more embedded with a kind of theological aim, and I can come
Mm.
to that more. But Francois Duc de la Rochefoucauld, and he, La Rochefoucauld, has these amazing lines about how all our virtues are just vices in disguise. And so he's been picked up by people like Nietzsche as being this really interesting observer of the darkness of human nature.
Mm.
Another person who's writing in this period is Pascal. So for both La Rochefoucauld and Pascal, they're writing in these fragmentary forms. They're trying to get to Pascal's writing pensée, La Rochefoucauld's writing aphorisms, and they're trying to get to a description of the human being. Now, La Bruyere says, look, everyone's reading La Rochefoucauld and Pascal. My book's going to be exactly like this. And what he does is write this best-selling copy of the characters or manners of the age. So what does that mean? It means he's describing tax collectors. He's describing women. He's describing court society. And in doing so, he gives people these kind of allegorical names. So he says, this guy is called Narcissus. This person is called Alcippus. But then later, keys to each of the characters start being published where people say, oh, I think I know who he means. And so it
Ah.
ran into like 10 editions because, and someone recently described it as a modern media enterprise because people were trying to guess who he was describing. And what's so brilliant about it is that he is just doing something quite profoundly sociological. So I wanted to, if we have time, I wanted to read one of the ones of the rich or the poor.
Please.
Okay. So this is an example of a La Bruyere one. I've kind of given away the plot, but you'll see. Giton has a fresh complexion, a smooth face, a steady and resolute look, large shoulders, a full crest, a firm and deliberate step. He speaks boldly and must have every word repeated that is spoken to him, and is but indifferently pleased with everything. He extends his handkerchief, he puts it to his nose, he blows hard enough for all to hear him, he spits about the room and sneezes aloud. I'll skip a little bit. He is merry, very laughable, impatient, choleric, a libertine and a politician. He believes himself a great wit and a great genius. But 'tis certain he is rich. So you get this amazing sociological portrait.
Well, isn't that?
It's
Yeah.
so good. And then you finally get at the end a sense of what he really is.
Really is. And that really clinches it. Right.
And then you have a one that follows of his opposite. Phaedon has hollow eyes, a red face, a lean body, and a meagre look. His sleep is little, and his slumbers light. He is a thinking man, but with the sense he has the air of a blockhead. He forgets speaking what he knows, or talking of those accidents with which he is acquainted. When he sometimes speaks, he is foolish and concise in his relations. He is never hearkened to or taken notice of. If he desires to sit, he puts himself on the brink of a seat. He talks low in conversation and has a bad accent. He seldom opens his mouth but to reply. He blows his nose under his hat. He spits in his handkerchief.
Yeah.
He gets into a corner to sneeze. In short, he is very poor.
Yeah. Wow. That is really something else. And of course, we get into what's the phrase? Masters of suspicion or hermeneutics of suspicion, right? Clearly, there's all this, and then you see what's really going. Let's just scrape it all away. And Marx must have loved these things. Marx must have loved these. I don't know.
I have no idea if he read them. I mean, I think like La Bruyere, of all of the writers that I deal with, has something much more to do with that kind of tradition of social reform.
Right.
Both because of the kinds of types he's describing and the sensitivity he has to class, really. Although for him, it's kind of rich and poor. He also has this unbelievably heart-wrenching description of the peasants that he describes being seen as kind of animals on the land, but from a perspective of kind of understanding. but because he was also a social reformer. So he had a little group of people with whom he was trying to develop social reform and trying to purify these morals of the age that he thought had gone wrong.
Mhm.
And so he's writing this to satirize the world, to show it up for the horror that it is, and includes this final chapter, which is like, okay, you should all turn to God and that's going to help you. And yeah, when I first wrote this, I toyed with thinking about how Brecht might actually even be an interesting parallel to what La Bruyere is doing in a way. It's like, let me show you all your flaws socially.
Yeah,
And the question is, yeah, and what do we need to do next?
right.
What kind of political system or social system or theological system for La Bruyere do we need to turn to properly remedy these ills?
So and of course, it's not surprising that these went to, instead of, it went also to country types, right?
Yeah.
This is what it's like to be a French person, or this is what it's like to be a British person. And, you know, I noticed that these people all have French names, right? La Bruyere, Pascal, the one that I can't pronounce is it's so
Yeah.
long. And I know that you made an interesting point about how the in England the character sketch got caught up politically with a capital P, I guess, and it didn't in France. And in France, it got kind of more. It just deepened in as philosophy. So maybe that explains the why these names tend to be French, but also one could wonder whether there's something about the French type that makes this sort of argument more persuasive or compelling.
Yeah, I think like there's a lot there. These questions are so great.
Well,
So
they're
yeah,
stuffed with way too much. But anyway, go on.
no,
Yeah,
it's good. So the first thing might be to clarify what happened in the English case as to how they got political. And so that's a story I tell in relation to this hugely expanding genre of character types of these new political figures that kept occurring. So
right.
the malignant or the royalist, the roundhead, then you get character types of people who had been there for a while but were newly politicized, the Jesuits. So you have this kind of explosion of lots of anonymous character types written by people who are trying to make sense of all these new factions
Mhm.
within this upheaval, English Revolution, Civil War, trying to understand the age. Now, in France, you have the Fronde, which is a similar kind of political upheaval, and you get lots of portraits. So you get lots of portraits of named individuals as opposed to sketches of types of people.
Okay.
So it's just a little bit of a kind of historical mystery. And
Ah,
that might be related to the way those two conflicts worked. One was kind of intra-noble, the other had a few more factions in the British case. Or it might be to do with which kinds of texts, which kinds of adaptations of the characters had been translated into French.
okay.
But all this to say is that what ends up happening is you, get a kind of continuation of the sense that the character sketch is a third form of philosophy. So La Bruyere, clearly working from Casabon, that early modern 16th century translator I mentioned earlier. La Bruyere is clearly working his edition and says, actually, here I am again, saying that writing characters is a third kind of philosophy. But for him, he says, look, I'm against Descartes and people who think if you want to describe feelings, all you need is a kind of physiological or biological explanation. People who say things about the bloods and nerves, etc. And I'm also against contemporary Aristotelians who say, all right, I'll just give you a table of mean, excess, and deficiency of all these qualities like cowardice, courage, recklessness.
Right.
La Bruyere says, no, I've got a third thing. It's going to be this character sketch again.
Great.
So that becomes a lineage that kind of continues a little bit more seamlessly in the French case. Whereas in the English case, you've got this explosion, as I said earlier, of sociological types that happen in the 17th century, the drunken Dutchman, the host, my tailor. And then you get all these political types that people are really interested in writing. Let me tell you who the Roundhead really is. I'll
Right.
write a character sketch of him.
Right. Let's talk about. Let me see here. Let's talk about Hume. Let's talk about. So Hume says let's do anatomy. I have this third type, but one of the things he's talking about is he favors anatomy over painting. Is that fair?
Yeah,
Okay. And what we get is this idea that anatomy is not as it's not as immediate, it's not as intuitive, it's not striking. It's kind of mediated. You have to go through several steps of argument before you get like yeah, anatomy is so focused on getting underneath things that sometimes it misses a recognizable form. Is that fair?
I think that's a beautiful way of putting it.
Okay. And I was really struck by you saying that he thereby inaugurates social science. I don't know if you could speak to that, but it just reminded me so much of social science. This idea, let's find a few animating principles. Let's forget about all the details. We'll find a few basic things here. And that's kind of it just, I mean, I'm a social scientist. Or I was trained as one. So I just have that in my blood. Yeah. But I thought that was fascinating. If you could speak to that, yeah.
Yeah. So part of how I approach that issue is through Hume's very notorious essay of national characters. So after writing the first inquiry, which says, look, I'm going to give up writing sketches of characters like people have done before. I'm going to instead do this approach of finding the principles behind things, and maybe I'll use a bit of rhetorical flourish here and there.
Hmm.
Hume, same year, writes of national characters. Now, we've spoken about national characters. There's a whole tradition of
Right.
writing the characters of nations in this highly rhetorical way. So you have characters of Italy, which say the Neapolitans are as fiery as their soil, and they give like huge examples. Or the
Yeah.
Netherlands, where I now live, and so people, I can mock it through these 17th century
Yeah.
types.
Yeah.
Then it's like the Netherlands, the Low Countries are like a cheese filled with holes in it. And so you get these like amazing rhetorical extended metaphors. Now, Hume's obviously not doing that. In Of National Characters, he said, I'm not doing that kind of thing. But he does want to figure out why nations have characters at all.
Yeah.
And so he ends up asking the kind of underlying question,
Right.
what does it mean to even say something has a character? And why this essay becomes notorious is in the course of his argument, which is all about customs are what makes a nation's character.
Right.
He ends up adding this very racist footnote.
Hmm.
And there's an amazing commentator of Hume, scholar of Hume, Aaron Garrett, who says Hume, the way Hume makes the argument in the footnote is really all about Hume trying to say, there's this phenomenon I can't explain. I'm just going to, shove it into my argument and hope for the best. And Aaron Garrett there is saying, well, look, this is exactly the kind of, should warn us against the errors in social science, where if a phenomenon doesn't fit, you end up developing a kind of crazy argument to try and make it fit as much as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. I just noticed I didn't even realize I got lost track of time completely. I wanted to say I really learned so much from this book. There were so many things that were new to me and that I took little paths down. And so it was great to read and great to talk with you about it. I appreciate your time. Good
Oh,
luck
thank you so
luck
much.
to you.
It flew by. I was like,
I know.
we have so many more things we could discuss.
There certainly are. Yeah. We could go on and on about mansplaining. I can mansplain myself anyway. Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, August.
Bye bye.